Well, let's go back to the king of the north. Why aren't people looking north these days? Why aren't people looking into the prophecies of Daniel, particularly Daniel chapter 11? Do people even understand that the Antichrist will come out of the north? North where? Not north in Israel, but north of Israel. Why aren't people looking north? Well, some people are, no doubt, because you have a king in the north presently that's shaking up the whole world, and that, of course, is Putin. Well, of course, you're going to think to yourself, is Putin just another king that's rising up and has risen up in the north? And we're thinking, is he or isn't he, or could he be the Antichrist? Well, again, you have to look into the various prophecies about the same. And of course, looking north of Israel is the place we're supposed to look according to Ezekiel and according to Daniel. This frequently comes up. There's not just one prophecy about the king rising up in the north. There's various prophecies that talk of the same. For instance, it's not just in Daniel, it's also in Ezekiel. And here's Ezekiel prophesying. Let's go back here to Ezekiel 38, chapter 38. And you have, therefore, Son of Man, prophesy. So you have a prophecy regarding Gog being the Antichrist. Thus saith the Lord God, in that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it. Now, this is God talking to the very Antichrist, the king of the north. And in this prophecy, you have Israel dwelling safely. And because these days you have Israel dwelling safely. Israel is largely dwelling safely with aid from America. And if you look at the prophecies of Daniel regarding the king of the north, king of the south, largely the two countries that come up, let's say the king of the north in those days, largely you're looking at Syria, but it's a lot more than just Syria. It was quite a large amount of countries in the north where we should be looking in those days. And the king of the south, going back when Daniel got the prophecies in Daniel chapter 11, would have been Egypt. So these two countries and empires, in fact, battling it out with Israel caught up in the middle of all of this. Well, when you look at these prophecies, they're largely confined largely to the Middle East. But in the last days, all of this would expand into the whole world. We're not just confined to the Middle East. If you want to understand the politics of the whole world in the last days, you have to look at the Middle East. You have to look at Israel. You have to look at history. You have to go back on biblical history and the history of the spiritual struggle of the children of Israel. Well, back then they were under God and they were struggling to survive as a nation, and therefore they were caught up in the middle of things, largely at times because they ruled themselves, but at other times they'd go into captivity, and so time would go by and you'd have these great battles that would rage from the north to the south with Israel caught up in the middle of all of this. And so you had the reality of the king of the north, the king of the south, which is born out in Daniel chapter 11, which would again be revisited largely in the last days. Well, if you're looking at the king of the north, you had what was called the Seleucid Empire. The king of the south, you had the Ptolemaic Empire, which was Egypt. Well, what happened was, going back in history, you had Alexander the Great. Well, is Alexander the Great in the Bible? Yes, he is. Alexander the Great comes up time and time again. And so what would happen was, of course, after the fall, the death of Alexander the Great, his kingdom would be split up amongst his four generals. You'd have a general in the north of Israel, not north in Israel, but the north of Israel. You'd have a general in the south. The general in the north was the Seleucid Empire, and the general in the south was in control of Egypt. these two would battle it out for dominion of the whole world to bring back Alexander the Great's empire to its former glory, and they, of course, being ruler over the same. And so these wars would rage between the king of the north, king of the south. Well, when you look at Ezekiel's prophecy, he prophesies that this king, that Gog, the Antichrist, would arise out of the north. Therefore, in verse 14, therefore, Son of Man, prophesy. So it's a prophecy. Ezekiel's now prophesying into the future, and he's talking about the rise of Gog, the Antichrist, and it's pinpointing where the Antichrist is going to arise from. The northern parts. So therefore, Son of Man, so this is God, this is the Lord talking to Ezekiel. Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say unto Gog, thus saith the Lord God. In that day, right, in the last days, when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it? Well, the Antichrist in the last days is going to know that Israel is dwelling safely. And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts. Well, here's the north parts here. And it goes on to say in verse 17, thus 17, in the same chapter 38 of Ezekiel, thus saith the Lord God, art thou he of whom I have spoken of in old times by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? So, of course, this concerns the children of Israel and their struggles and their nation. Therefore, Ezekiel is prophesying regarding the Antichrist of how he's going to invade Israel from the north in the last days. Well, again, it's interesting to read of Gog here. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at the same time being the last days, shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Well, you think to yourself, does the Antichrist even know he's the Antichrist? You have in verse 17, thus saith the Lord God. Now this is the Lord God talking to the very Antichrist. Art thou he of whom I have spoken of in old times by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I would bring thee against them? And so God, at the time will go by, and God will put hooks in the jaws of the Antichrist and bring him down from the north. So basically what I'm saying is, this is pinpointing the exact place where the Antichrist is going to arise from. And we're talking about Gog of Magog, Magog being Russia. So Russia, Bible scholars and experts pinpoint Magog as being Russia. And so you're looking at this king that arises in the north of Israel. God puts hooks in the jaws of this Antichrist, brings him down from the north to judge Israel for their sins in the last days. Not only does he judge Israel for their sins in the last days, but this time, as prophesied by Jesus Christ, in fact, he places the abomination of desolation. When ye shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. So in other words, we're looking at the arise of an Antichrist from the north of Israel, who will eventually invade Israel from the north, then place the abomination of desolation, which will trigger off the worst trouble in the world that has ever been since history or ever will be in history. And therefore, you'll have those days shortened, in other words, stops, which will bring us into the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, this is where things are all rolling along and going. And so you have a wider picture painted in the Bible, which all stems out of the Middle East. So in other words, if you want to understand the last days in the last days which we are now living, and the very last days to which we are going into, then you have to understand the politics of the Middle East. You have to understand the way the Bible sees the politics of the Middle East. You have to have some understanding of history, even as the Bible paints a very broad picture of history in the last days, and the rise and falls of great world empires until finally you'll have the rise of an Antichrist world empire. Well, does Alexander the Great come up in these prophecies? Yes, he does. Well, we're going to quickly go into Daniel chapter 8. This is relevant because this brings in the prophecies again of the king of the north and his rival, the king of the south, his rival, the king of the south being Egypt. The king of the north being Seleucid in those days, but in the latter time of their kingdom, in other words, it says. In the latter time of their kingdom, the kingdom of the Seleucids in the north, the kingdom of of Egypt in the south, a king of fierce countenance and understanding, dark sentences shall stand up in the north. Again, you're looking at the north of Israel. So let's go into Daniel chapter 8, and it's talking about Ezekiel right here in verse 8, and he's symbolized Alexander the Great and the Grecian Empire here is symbolized as a goat. So verse 8 in Daniel chapter 8. Therefore, so you have Alexander the Great's kingdom coming in here, and it's in prophecy, it even names the kingdom as Grecia, which is Greece. So, therefore, verse 8, therefore, the he-go, Alexander the Great's kingdom, and Alexander the Great, waxed very great. So, Alexander the Great, his kingdom comes in. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Alexander the Great dies. And for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. So, this great horn, Alexander the Great dies, falls, is broken. And these four little horns come up out of this, in place of this great horn that was broken. So for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. These are the generals that took over after Alexander the Great dies. Four generals take over, and they say to Alexander, who shall rule in your stead? Who's going to take over your kingdom? These words were spoken to Alexander the Great on his deathbed. And Alexander the Great said, you'll all have to fight over my great world empire and kingdom. And so eventually, time goes by, a few short days, and Alexander the Great died, and so they did. And the two that reigned supreme was the king of the north, king of the south. So, and one of them, and out of one of them came forth a little horn. So out of one of these four horns that grew in place of this great horn, being Alexander the Great, he dies. Out of one of them came forth a little horn. So what you picture here, you have four horns, four generals, in other words. One in the north, one in the south, one in the east, one in the west. Well, out of one of these is where the Antichrist is going to arise from, the northern regions of the kingdom of Israel from the north. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great. So this little horn starts out small. In the last days, you might see or hear of such a person, a little horn, and you might take no notice. In other words, kind of starts out small, and the time goes by, and this little horn will wax great. Alexander the Great dies, this great horn is broken. Out of it comes up four notable horns, but out of one of these will come forth a little horn. So in the latter time of their kingdom, the latter time of the kingdom of these four generals, a king of fierce countenance and understanding, dark sentences will stand up. Where? In the north. So verse 9, and out of one of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceedingly great toward the south. So he's waxing great towards the south. Where does this place him? In the north. Again, you have the king of the north. And towards the east and towards the pleasant land, where the pleasant land here is Israel. and it waxed great. So this little horn is now waxing great. It appears to grow larger and larger and larger. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven. This little horn waxes so great, becomes so powerful, that it even challenges the host of heaven. You picture this little horn waving its fists at the whole world. He's the king of the north. He's coming to power in the north. He's waving his fist. He's extending his hand and his power over the whole world. So much so that he starts extending his hand and power, even waving his fist at God and heaven and at God's children on earth. The host of heaven, waxed even greater, the host of heaven. The host of heaven is the children of God on earth in the last days. Symbolizes stars, symbolizes being the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the hosts of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. So this little horn waxes great and persecutes, in other words, God's children in the last days. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. So he magnifies himself, he grows in power and strength and might. He magnifies himself even to the prince of the host. So he's magnifying himself above Jesus. And so time goes by, and just as it says in Ezekiel, that he thinks an evil thought. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at the same time, when he's starting to wax great, shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Thus saith the Lord God, art thou he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I bring thee against them. And of course, Ezekiel here and Daniel here is talking to his people in his day. But these words are all written also for God's people in the last days. And so this little horn that comes out of the north, comes out of Magog, Russia, waxes great, to the point that he gets to the point when he thinks an evil thought and even challenges God himself, even stands up against Jesus Christ himself, even casts down some of the hosts of the stars of heaven to the ground, these symbolic of God's children in the last days. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, which is Jesus, so he's the Antichrist. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. So he invades Israel from the north. He takes away the daily sacrifice was taken away. The religious worship, in other words, they worship God. In the last days, the third temple will be rebuilt. And they resume animal sacrifice, where the Antichrist invades Israel from the north, takes away their form of animal sacrifice worship, and places the abomination of desolation. And the place of his sanctuary, in other words, God's temple, was cast down, was taken over by the Antichrist. Well, how do we know this little horn is going to rise in the last days, and the great horn that was broken is indeed Alexander the Great? Well, it names Grecia here, and the rough go is the king of Grecia in verse 21. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So you're looking at Alexander the Great. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. So in other words, Alexander the Great had a great world empire. These 4 generals, these 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. They won't be as powerful as Alexander the Great. They'll be battling out amongst each other to become as great as Alexander the Great was, to extend their hands over the various countries. The king of the north will be, in those days, the Seleucid Empire, and the king of the south will be Egypt. These two battling it out for dominion of the world in those days, largely being confined to the Middle East. But the world in the last days is now extended all out of the Middle East. The politics of the world today is all extending out of the Middle East. And so you have Israel, the land of Israel, caught up in the middle of this. You have God's people, the children of God, caught up in the middle of all of this. And you have the extended battle between the king of the north and the king of the south in the last days. All of this being revisited in the last days, and begs the question, Why aren't people reading Daniel chapter 11? This is the very chapter that Jesus told us to look to. To understand the last days and to understand how the abomination of desolation will be placed in the holy place in the last days. It says, as prophesied by Daniel the prophet, let him that readeth understand. Well, it takes a bit of looking into when you look into the prophecies of Daniel chapter 11. And you have to have all of this in mind, these various prophecies, even in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 7, all of this really largely leading us up to Daniel chapter 11. And so each time that the angel, largely you're looking at the angel Gabriel, appears to Daniel, each time the angel sheds a little more light on the same subject. And so each time at the end of these prophecies, Daniel doesn't always understand what they mean. He's frequently praying and asking for more understanding and more insight as to what the angel is explaining to him. Hence, you have so many different angles to these prophecies that it's like a giant puzzle in that you have to put all the pieces together. This might take a little time. The problem is these days people haven't got a lot of time. People are busy on little distractions and taking their pet pills and sensation seeking and such. Therefore, they're so overwhelmed with information they haven't got time for the wider great matters. They haven't got time to see the wider picture. So to sum all of this up in such a small time is extremely difficult, especially when you look at all of the various prophecies written here. Did the angel Gabriel sum this all up? Well, he summed it all up as condensed as he could. He didn't go into every aspect of history, but he did paint a picture of the great world empires that would rise and fall. So you have great world empires rising and falling as prophesied by Daniel before they even happened. Daniel at first being in the Babylonian Empire. Babylon would fall as prophesied and Media Persia would come in and God's people would be in captivity to Media Persia. The kingdom of Greece would come in with Alexander the Great and God's people would be in captivity to Alexander the Great's Grecian Empire. The Grecian Empire would fall and Rome would come in and God's people would be in captivity to Rome. Rome, of course, fell. In the last days, you'll have the Antichrist world empire, and God's people again will be in captivity to the Antichrist world empire. And this is everything that Daniel saw in his prophecies. So Daniel's prophecies largely dealing with grey world empires. Grey eras and ages, down through the ages, casting his mind, spanning his mind and visualizing way across history and way into the history of the future. And arriving slap bang in the middle of Daniel chapter 11 in the last days, and this continuing battle between the king of the north, king of the south, all of this revisited in the last days. So the rough goat, which is Grecia, which is Alexander the Great's kingdom, the great horn that is between his eyes, is the first king. This is Alexander the Great. Now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. So these 4 generals stand up, but they won't have the same power as Alexander the Great had. They'll be battling out for power and eventually they will decline and fall. All of this is brought out in Daniel chapter 11, the eventual rise of this, what they call the Hellenistic period. If you look this up, words like the Hellenistic period come up. You think, well, what the hell is the Hellenistic period if you're not familiar with this? And this era that followed the fall of Alexander the Great, they now call, historians call this a Hellenistic period. Well, is the Hellenistic period in the prophecies of Daniel? Yes, they are. It's in the prophecies of Daniel chapter 11. So what you have now, that being broken, Alexander the Great dies. That being broken, the great horn is broken. Whereas four stood up for it. Four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, out of Alexander the Great's kingdom. In other words, but not in his power. They won't have the same power as Alexander the Great had. They want that kind of power, but they won't have it. The Antichrist in the last days will want that power. He will have it. He will come out of the northern part of Alexander the Great's kingdom after the fall of Alexander the Great. So it says in verse 23, in the latter time of their kingdom, whose kingdom? The kingdom of this king of the north, king of the south, in fact. These four generals take over, and the two that reign supreme are the king of the north and king of the south. These two battling out the Seleucid Empire in the north and the Ptolemaic Empire in the south. The Seleucid Empire in the north, largely summed up as Syria. The Ptolemaic Empire in the south, largely summed up as Egypt. These two battling out for world dominion. In this Hellenistic period, when Alexander the Great dies, you had what historians now call the Hellenistic period. Now, I'm not going to pretend I'm familiar with that word, but if you simply look up the history, and the historians have simply summed up their age as when Alexander the Great died, you had these four generals that came in and sliced up Alexander the Great's kingdom. Now, these battling out, particularly the two that ended up battling out for world dominion, the two most powerful generals, would have been the Seleucid Empire in the north. This is largely summed up as Syria. The Ptolemaic Empire, Ptolemy, this general called Ptolemy in the south. This is largely summed up as Egypt. These two battling out for world dominion. And so it says, in the latter time of their kingdom, these were eventually dwindling. Why did they dwindle? Because Rome came in and took over. So the Hellenistic period you read, is the Hellenistic age and period in Daniel chapter 11? Yes, it is. Indeed, it is. And it's simply one way of summing it up. The angel appearing to Daniel, largely talking about great ages, great kingdoms that would rise and fall. That would rise and fall until eventually you had the rise of an Antichrist world empire. Well, with the fall of Alexander the Great's empire, you read they now sum up this age as being the Hellenistic period. Well, to simply sum up this Hellenistic period, looking at the fall of Alexander the Great. When that happened, these four generals take over. They slice up all of this land that Alexander the Great once ruled over. And so you have the king of the north, king of the south. Well, eventually Rome would come in. And when Rome came in, you'd have Cleopatra in the south, Cleopatra in Egypt. There's, if you read up on history on this, you'll read that there are 7, in fact, Cleopatras. Most people, I generally thought or understood one Cleopatra because she's the most famous. Because she got mixed up with Rome and married Roman emperors and stuff like this. Well, there are 7 Cleopatras. Well, is Cleopatra in these prophecies? Yes, she is. The first time you look up this and you look up various prophecies and various interpretations of these verses, and you find it's generally agreed that the king of the south in these prophecies eventually, Cleopatra the first, would stand up in Egypt. So you had these various dynasties. You had a dynasty in Egypt. You had the dynasty of Cleopatras. You had Cleopatra in Egypt. You had the dynasty of the Seleucid Empire in the north. And Israel, in other words, God's people of that day, caught up in the middle of all of this. To sum it up in short, you had the Syrians in the north and Egypt in the south. Because when you look this up, you think, well, how much did the Seleucid Empire extend to? Well, if you don't believe me, just simply look it up on Wikipedia, and you're looking at the Seleucid Empire here. You think, well, how much did Seleucid rule over? And you're looking it up and you're getting a picture of what countries the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus, so you're looking at 321 BC. Seleucus the first began expanding his dominion to include the Near Eastern territories that encompass. So you're looking at modern day Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria. And you're looking at the Levant, which would be Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. You're looking at Kuwait, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan. All of this ruled over by Seleucus in the north. And in the south, you had Ptolemy ruling over Egypt. Well, if you don't believe me, Alexander the Great, who quickly conquered the Persian Empire under his last acclamation, because this is very waffly, died young in 323 BC, leaving an expansive empire of partly Hellenized culture without an adult heir. The empire was put under the authority of a region, and so on it goes. And then you got the Alexander the Great's generals. Like I say, you read Wikipedia, it's very waffly, especially for someone like me. Alexander the Great, known as the Diadochi, jostled for supremacy over parts of his empire following his death. There you got Ptolemy the First, also a former general, and then current satrap of Egypt. So he takes over in Egypt, and so on it goes. The rise of the Seleucids in Babylon, and so on it goes. So you definitely, history points to the rise and fall of these great empires, and what they call in this same Wikipedia here. You can click on the little blue picture. You want the Hellenistic period. It's like I say, it's all very waffly, and I'm not going into the whole thing because it's so waffly, but you do get a definite picture of history after Alexander the Great, and the kingdoms that come up is the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, and what they call the Hellenistic period. Like I say, I don't like to sound scholarly, but the classic antiquity, the Hellenistic period, covers the time in the Mediterranean history after classical Greece, which Alexander the Great ruled over between the death of Alexander. Is the Hellenistic period right here in the words of Wikipedia. If you don't believe me, believe Wikipedia. If you don't believe me, believe history. If you don't believe me, believe the angel. The angel saying that Alexander the great horn would be broken. These four horns, these four generals would take over. And this king, this little horn, would come out of one of these four horns and would be king of the north, waxing strong towards the south. In the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. So again, standing up in the north. Well, here's the Hellenistic period. Back to this, the Hellenistic period was what? Between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC to the death of Cleopatra the Seventh, followed by the emergence of the Roman Empire. So what you've got really, after the death of Alexander the Great, you had these four generals taking over, these battling it out with Israel. In other words, God's people caught up in the middle of all of this. And then it pinpoints this little horn that would rise out of the north. Well, that time period is simply called in history, they call this the Hellenistic period, between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC to the death of Cleopatra the Seventh, followed by the emergence of Rome. So what happened? Rome came in. So in other words, you have in the latter time of their kingdom, in the latter time of the kingdom of these four generals that stand up after Alexander the Great dies, in the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences will stand up in the north. Well, that reign, let's say, of the king of the north, king of the south, the Seleucid Empire of the north, largely summed up these days as Syria, and the Ptolemaic kingdom in the south, largely summed up as Egypt. This is called the Hellenistic period. If you look at all these things on Wikipedia and history, which is all prophesied in Daniel chapter 11. And so you'll have this king that stands up in Daniel chapter 11 when this era, this time period, this Hellenistic period, this time period between the king of the north being Seleucid empire of that day and Egypt battling out with Israel caught up in the middle of all this. In the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences. Now that being broken, right? Four stood up. The Alexander the Great's kingdom is broken here. Four stood up for it. Four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. In other words, this king that stands up in the north, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. In other words, his power is coming from Satan. It's coming from Satan because why? He thinks an evil thought. The Antichrist thinks an evil thought, as prophesied in the writings of Ezekiel. He thinks an evil thought and things come into his mind. God saying to him, art thou not he whom I prophesied in time past? That shall come in the last days. And so it says again, you're looking at Ezekiel 38. If Ezekiel 38, find the chapter quick. So we're in 37, 38. Thus saith the Lord God, art thou he of whom I have spoken in the old time by my servants, the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years, thou bring thee against them. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at that time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Well, here he is right here, standing up in the north, in the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding, dark sentences, shall stand up. Where does he stand up? In the north. And his power shall be mighty, so his power is coming from Satan himself. Something these four generals, the king of the north, would dearly love to have achieved, but didn't. The Seleucid Empire and the Egyptian Ptolemaic Empire finally crumbled. In the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall indeed stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. His power is coming from Satan himself. And he shall destroy wonderfully. He's going to have all of this advanced technology on his side. When you look at the kings of the north now, and you think, who stands strong in the north? Who rules in the north? Who's holding, in fact, the balance of power in Syria? Who's keeping the balance of power in Syria that Israel favours in the north? Well, the one that Israel actually favours in the north is actually Putin. Why Putin? Why is Putin favoured in the north for Israel? Well, Israel favours Putin in Syria, the king of the north in the old days, the Seleucid Empire being largely Syria. Well, you think, well, how does this play out today? You have still Syria. You have still Egypt. Well, who's holding the balance of power in Syria? Well, it's Putin. Why doesn't Israel come out against the Ukrainian war strongly? Because it favours Putin in Syria. Syria's holding the balance of power in Syria and is keeping Israel safe from Iran in the north. So Putin is good for Israel at the moment, so it's holding the balance of power in the north. In fact, he's kind of a man of peace, as it says in Daniel chapter 11, how he's going to come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So you have Putin in Syria in the north of Israel, and he's kind of come in peaceably. He's come in as a kind of a peace broker. He has his troops there, and he's holding the balance of power there. And in this respect, it's keeping Israel somewhat safe from Iran. And who do you have in Egypt? Well, who's holding the balance of power in Egypt? Who's giving Egypt all of this money? Who's taking a bribe? Who's taking a gift? Well, Egypt's taking a gift. Who's behind Syria these days? You have Putin, the king of the north, who has all of these powerful weapons that's standing up in the north. And you have Putin again, who's standing up in the north. Again, you look at these prophecies and you look at Putin standing up in the north. And of course, you're going to wonder, will this be the one that's going to think an evil thought? Will this be the one who waxes great in the last days? We'll start out small. We'll start out as a little horn, but we'll wax great. Is this the one that's going to think an evil thought? Is this the one that things shall come into his mind? And you look at the king of the south, Egypt, in these days, and you think, well, how's Egypt doing these days? That was under the Ptolemaic Empire. In those days, you had the Seleucids in the north, let's say Syria. You now have Russia in Syria holding the balance of power there, keeping Israel somewhat safe. Israel is largely in support of Putin because he holds the balance of power there and keeps them safe. Well, in the south, who's behind? Who's keeping the balance of power there? Who's keeping Egypt at peace with Israel? Well, you have America. So the politics of the Middle East is now extended into the whole world. Well, who's the king of the north? You think, well, it looks like Russia. Who's the king of the south? Well, you're looking at Egypt. And you're looking at Egypt taking a bribe, taking a gift from America pumping all this money, giving them money to keep the peace with Israel in the last days. But of course, again, you're looking at, in the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark senses shall stand up, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully. Who has the most advanced technology in these days? Who has the most powerful weapons these days? You're looking again at Russia. You're looking presently at Putin. And shall prosper. So this king's going to prosper and practice what? Scientific witchcraft. And shall destroy shall destroy mighty nations. Who's bringing down the whole world? Who's bringing us into economic chaos and woe? By course of event, who's bringing down the Western world? Who's bringing us into great recession? Who's bringing us into all this inflation? Who's bringing the Western world to their knees economically? Well, again, you're looking at this king of the north, and shall destroy the mighty nations and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft, in other words, scientific witchcraft, to prosper in his hands, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince, where is Jesus, stand up against the prince of priests. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. In other words, at the second coming of Jesus Christ, this king that stands up in the north, that waxes great in the north, will eventually be broken without hand by Jesus Christ in the last days. So I'll stop it there. We're 42 minutes in people's extension span. I've done my best to cram this into a few short minutes. And God willing, I'll have to call this part one. And then go on into part two, this kind of giving you some kind of background of these visions and visitations that Daniel received from Gabriel, spanning across the centuries into the last days and arriving in Daniel chapter 11, painting again the same picture of this revisited in the last days, in the latter time of their kingdom. I hope you got that. The king of the north, king of the south. This king of the north will stand up in the last days. And this king that stands up in the northern regions of Israel, that stands up in the north, in the latter time of their kingdom, would indeed be the very Antichrist. He standing up in the north and placing the abomination of desolation in the holy place, which brings in the great tribulation, not the wrath period. Many Bible scholars call this time period the Great Tribulation, the wrath period. This isn't the wrath period. This is the Great Tribulation. Immediately after the tribulation of those days is when Jesus appears. Then begins the wrath period. These two are two separate events, but this is another matter. But the important thing to consider here is these last days and the pinpointing of exactly what location the Antichrist will arise from. And you're looking at the northern regions, so praise Jesus, of Israel.